All right, 1, 2, 3. We're live on that. And then okay, we live on Facebook, I believe. Yep. Then we gotta go to embed. And that's live. Okay. All right. Okay, good evening, everyone. Jim Wlliams, Hurricane City, here with you to wrap up the hurricane season. I hope everybody made it through okay. I know it was a tough season for a lot of people. 63% of the locations in the Hurricane City database were impacted. Normally, it's around 50%, so it was a little higher than normal. In fact, you have to go all the way back to 2020 that we had a more active season. There's the 2020 season where we had 83% of the basin impacted. And then, of course, this year was 63%, but still almost double of what last year's numbers were as far as impacts to land. Now, my main focus tonight is going to be on the 5 landfalling hurricanes that impacted land this year in the Caribbean and the United States. And I'm going to go through those and tell you what models performed the best on each of those big name storms that were headliners. I'm going to talk about how we covered it, how we covered each storm, and what the most interesting moments were, the statistics for each storm that did make landfall. But before I get to that, those 5 storms, I want to put some special thanks out. Bill Phillips has been with me for about, almost 20 years now, since 2003. He's been with me helping out with the broadcast. So he helped me with Beryl this year, Hurricane Helene, and Milton, which I was in both of those. And Bill was helping me co-broadcast as those hurricanes were making landfall. And I also want to put a special thanks out to Chris Hollis in Tampa. Chris has been helping Hurricane City for a long time. He does some of the coding behind the scenes, and especially a lot of the Hurricane Hunter and model data that you see at Hurricane City, which I get emails all the time from people that use that stuff, and they really like it. Using the models and the best performing models and going back to the best track data to look, and those go back years, by the way. You can go and look at the best track data from any hurricane you want to know about, and you can find out how the models performed, the best track data, what the recon did, and all those storms. So it's really a massive storing facility for, if you will, of hurricane statistics and data from past hurricanes. But, the National Hurricane Center did a really good job this year. And The common perception with all the politics this year of people saying, well, the Hurricane Center messed up, or they didn't do this right, or they didn't do that right. While I have some issue with some of the outlooks they do, the tracks and the intensity forecasts were much better this year. In fact, the National Hurricane Center outperformed. Now, I'm talking about the mainstream models, like the ones you see at like Tropical Tidbits, for example, where you get the GFS Euro, you get the Canadian model, you get the UK Met, you get um, the tropical models, the HWRF and the HAFS A and B. So I like to use those models and compare against what the National Hurricane Center did. So the National Hurricane Center on the five major hurricane, they weren't all major, but the five significant hurricanes that impacted land this year, the Hurricane Center won three of them on track alone, beat all the models, and on intensity they beat all the models on two of the storms, Beryl and Milton. They outperformed the models on the intensity. And that's always been a sticking point in the past with the National Hurricane Center, is they do well on track, but they don't always do well on intensity. And this year they improved that quite a bit. So I just wanted to say they did an excellent job this year down at the National Hurricane Center. Not perfect. It's never going to be perfect. But the cones were much better this year. The overall track, and the only beef I have with them was on Hurricane Milton, of course. They were predicting it to hit around 8 o'clock, 9 o'clock at night. 2 o'clock in the morning, and it ended up hitting at 8 o'clock at night. So they were 5 hours a little early on the landfall on that. But other than that, they did really well on most of when it mattered most. So as far as the hurricane hunters, they passed through the eye of 80 hurricanes. That's amazing. And deployed 1,246 instruments. This is from the National Hurricane Center. They sent in 17 unmanned systems into hurricanes, 91 drones, and this did end up being the second costliest hurricane season on record at $200 billion in damage. So, I kind of feel like the one thing I did like about this season was the fact that the storms were kind of spaced apart. You know how some hurricane seasons, it seems like you're getting onslaughted with sometimes 2 and 3 and 4 named storms at the same time, and sometimes two of them are threatening land at the same time. The good thing about this hurricane season is every significant threat was, after it happened, there was a space where it was a week or a 10-day period where you could take a deep breath and kind of lick your wounds if you were in the impacted areas instead of looking out there and going, oh, here comes another one. So it was kind of spaced nicely, which I really liked. Sometimes now, like I said, it's just an onslaught, and it becomes a massive, especially for me, updating Hurricane City. It can be a real problem considering I run a business and I can't always be there to update the site all day long. So it was nice to know there was some consistency in the spacing between the storms this year. So that was a real good help for this hurricane season. And I just want to get this out of the way too. Speaking of Hurricane City, the front page, I'm going to probably do a redesign on that in this off season coming up. You know how the tracking map is the center of the website, and then you have a navigation bar to the right? What I'm going to do is make the map full screen. In other words, horizontal all the way across your screen. If you have a big screen monitor at home, you might look at Hurricane City and there's black to the right and to the left where there's like no space being used. I'm going to make it 100% fitting the browsers, and the map is going to be like twice the size. And then there's going to be links below the map, and some of them are going to be individual model links. We're going to try to incorporate models more into Hurricane City. So that's going to be quite a amount of work there to get that accomplished. But I will have it ready for June 1st, next hurricane season. And your donations are so important. I know I don't have a huge amount of people that donate, and I really I don't like groveling for donations, but the fact of the matter is the donations that do come in pay for the server cost and the operations to run Hurricane City. But honestly, just to go on one intercept, to go cover one hurricane, is like minimum a couple $1,000s. It's that high. And we're not talking equipment breakdowns and things like that. I'm just talking travel cost and gas and lodging and the whole 9 yards, plus the fact that I have to shut my business down. So it really is taxing to go on these intercepts. It's very expensive. And, when I do these storms, I've been doing this for since the late 90s at Hurricane City and covering these hurricanes in a live format back when we had dial up connections and 56K modems. So I would just do audio only covering hurricanes. And some of those old videos are over at Hurricane City on the archive page. But the overall amount of money it costs to do this is phenomenal because when I go into these hurricanes, I'm not just going there and slapping a dashboard up a camera up on a dashboard and going into the storm like a lot of storm chasers do. I'm out there actually setting cameras up in the storm surge zones, and it takes time to do that. And I kind of have to rush because I don't have the luxury of spending a week or 10 days in the impact area. So I get in there, try to set the cameras up, cover the hurricane, then try to retrieve the cameras as quick as possible, and try to do that way. So it is expensive and we need the funding. So if you are already donating, maybe you can help out a little more, or if you can spread the word out to people to help out any way you can. Because remember, Hurricane City is not just, a guy with a camera on a dashboard going into a storm, but there's the database, there's the predictions, which I'm going to get into in a minute. There's of course, the live shows like you're watching right now. There's the how big was it page comparing one hurricane to the other. There's the A-Bear box page. There's the off-season hurricane page. There's all these pages that constantly have to be updated, and it's a statistical nightmare. But anyway, by the way, the comments are open tonight on Facebook. We're streaming on Facebook and YouTube and on the embed page. If you're on either one of those platforms, you can comment. Bill Phillips right away. It's $1,000. I mean, just for the plane tickets alone. That's when he comes because I drive, of course, and he comes down or flies in. And you also need I need a new computer. Yeah, so there's a whole list of things I have to get for the off season, but I need a new computer. I need a new mini for the road because we're doing this with smart devices. That's another thing that separates me from all the other storm chasers out there is we're using smart devices to produce all this stuff. And so there's a lot of gadgets in the truck and I try to get outside the truck and film and then we have an anemometer on top of the truck. We show the anemometer readings during the show. So I've got to get the new RM Young anemometer cups this off season. And Mark Soot from HurricaneTrack.com said he would donate his old monitor that he used to use with the RM Young. So I'll be able to bring that on the road. We also have the new holder, a new wiring harness that has to go into the truck. There's probably some other things I'm forgetting, and I just the list is a mile long. But anyway, the donations are badly needed at Hurricane City because the cost of everything keeps going up, and actually, like I said, the donations that are currently coming in are barely enough to cover the expenses that we have racked up for just the server alone and all the services, the domains, and everything else. So anyway. All right, so let's get to it. Let's get started with the 5 big storms this year that impacted land. And we're going to start with Beryl. So here is the desktop presentation. Again, this was the count for this year. 88 areas were affected, 63% of the locations in the Hurricane City database. And you notice the focus is on Florida, of course. And then late in the season, we ended up with Sarah down in the Caribbean that hit as a tropical storm in Honduras and in Belize down here. And then, of course, we had the usual Bermuda getting impacted every year, and the Azores out here was impacted by Tropical Storm Patty way out in the East Atlantic. But the bulk of the activity was Florida, with most of the Caribbean being impacted by at least tropical storm force winds, but the big one was Hurricane Beryl. So let's get started on Beryl. And let's switch images here. So, actually, I wanted to start on the predictions. Sorry about that. I wanted to start the program tonight with my predictions and how I did this past season. So, on late May, I come out with my predictions, and I'll show you the exact breakdown in a minute. But here were my high risk areas, and if you zoom in on this, you can see the southeast, the western Bahamas and southeastern Florida, I thought were at highest risk going into this season, and it turned out good news for these areas, of course, because the only system that impacted them was Hurricane Milton when it was passing north of the Bahamas on the way into the Atlantic, and of course, southeast Florida was impacted by 40+ mile per hour winds. So they were impacted, but that wasn't really what I was expecting for southeast Florida. I really felt like something bigger was going to hit there, especially late in the season. But I did get some of my high risk areas here. Um, we had Francine over here near Morgan City, so there was one there. Of course, Cozumel from Hurricane Beryl. We had Raphael impact Grand Cayman, Little Cayman, Cayman Brac, and we also had the Grenada area down here impacted. Let me get rid of this here. Okay, so why is that not working? Okay, so yeah, I didn't have the Grenada area, but again, I did pick up on the Caymans, Cozumel, Morgan City, and that was it. Overall, though, and here's the late season tracks I was thinking was going to happen here. In fact, some of the models, the GFS and the Euro, were latching onto something. In fact, early on in Raphael, they were thinking this was going to be a possible track, and that never materialized. Had it materialized, I would have nailed my predictions this year. It's just one of those things. I called this the pitchfork map because I was really thinking mid-season something would come in to the Bahamas and scrape Florida, head up the eastern seaboard, and out to sea. We didn't get either of these tracks. And here are my predictions and what ended up happening. So highlighted in yellow are the areas that were impacted. So it looks like most of them, but in reality, this is 11 out of the 20 of my top 20. So that's about 52% of all my picks were impacted this year. Very high threat was 40%. So Great Abaco was impacted by Milton, and the Cayman Islands were impacted by Beryl and Raphael. So that those are my only two top five. Usually I get 3 or 4 out of my top five, and this year I only got 2. As far as miles from center, they were averaging the two out of my top 5 averaged 84.5 miles from center. In other words, the storms passed. Milton was about 160 miles. I had this written down. Yeah, Milton was about 146 miles to the north of Great Abaco Island, and Raphael hit Little Cayman and Cayman Brac directly. Well, it was 23 miles to the west. So if you add those two numbers up and divide it by 2, it gives you 84.5. My normal is around 60 miles from center, so I didn't do real well on that either. Again, I got 11 out of 20, 52%. And this is where I really messed up on my predictions this year. I predicted 28 to 30 named storms, and we ended up with 18. So if you take my low end, I was still off by about 10 named storms. That was terrible. And unfortunately, my predictions do rely on the accuracy of how many named storms I'm expecting. However, when you get over 18 named storms, generally, the numbers don't change very much as far as what areas get impacted, because once you get over 18, it's considered an extremely active season. So the impact areas don't really change all that much. But overall, I give it, on a 1 to 10, I give my predictions this year like a 5. It wasn't good. It wasn't real bad. It was just, it was okay. It wasn't great. So before the season started, when I was back on Twitter. I've been off Twitter since I resigned from Twitter. I just couldn't deal with the political stuff. But anyway, somebody, one of the, I think it was a Puerto Rican, I think cycle forums over there on Twitter posted all of the predictions that everybody made, and you see mine at the second from the top there. Let me zoom in on this. So I predicted what he did was he averaged to 28 to 30 and came up with 29, right? And I picked 11 hurricanes and 4.5 majors. So I was right about the majors and the hurricanes, because the reality of it is we ended up with 5 major hurricanes this year, and we had 11 hurricanes. So I mean, I nailed the amount of hurricanes. So I mean, I nailed those. I just was off on the overall number of named storms. But I wasn't the only one that was way off on the amount of named storms. I mean, look at this. Crown Weather, they were 25 off. The Weather Channel was 25. I mean, 25 named storms rather. So they were way off by like 7. Weather Tiger 24, and then you go down the list. Colorado State, Phil Klotzbeck, he said 23, and again, this was all before the season started. So he was off by 5 named storms. AccuWeather predicted 22. So when you get to the bottom of this list, let me pull it up here. So Arizona University, Meteo France, and North Carolina all were in the ballpark of predicting how many named storms were going to be. North Carolina 17.5, Meteo France, and Arizona at 21. But the majority of the forecasting people that have a legitimate track record were way above what actually happened this year. So nobody can claim that they were really good this year. Maybe North Carolina, that is pretty good, I got to admit. But as far as individuals and people that have been doing this, I think it was kind of everybody kind of busted this year on the amount of named storms. And the reason for that is the La Nina never materialized. And I'll get to the graphics on that in a minute. But I was predicting a La Nina for the season, and we never really got out of neutral for Enzo. We came into the season in El Nino and then gradually phased it out, and we were neutral for most of the hurricane season, which really kept the numbers down a little bit. I think they would have been a little higher had we gotten into La Nina, but we never did get into La Nina this season. So, McNuckle, just a bad year for predictions all around. That's true. Thank you very much. By the way, if you'd like to comment, I'll be happy to put your comments on air, and that's from Dr. McNuckle, Dr. Knuckle, Mr. the Knuckle. I guess I'm getting that right. I don't know. Anyway, so here is my track record over the years. So this was posted by, who posted this? I chopped that off. Sorry about that. So within 2 storms, right, of predicting how many named storms there's going to be, I'm pretty much near the top of the list at 37.5. Not that that's that great. 37% of the time I'm correct with getting it within 2 storms, but it's still better than CSU, Weatherbell, UK Met, Penn, NOAA, and AccuWeather, but not quite as good. The Weather Channel did better, Arizona State, TSR, and Weather Probe, and this is over since, I think he calculated since 2005, I believe, that's how far back this goes. So my track record's been pretty good over the years as far as predicting how many named storms and everything else, but it's just this year was just one of those, the environmental variables didn't pan out the way everybody was thinking it was. So I talked earlier in the hurricane season about AI, right? So I did the AI thing, and I ran a numerical sequence on AI. So what I did was I took the AI, I had my own bot, which I got rid of. I ran my own bot and took all the data since 1990 of NAO from NOAA and averaged it out over the 20-year period and asked AI to figure out, based on numerical sequencing, all that's doing is taking all the past data at the height of the hurricane season and saying, this is what I think is going to happen into 2024. AI predicted that we would be in a neutral NAO situation during the height of the hurricane season. That didn't happen. So AI was wrong, and we ended up in a negative NAO. So what happens when you have a negative NAO? Well, here it is. And ironically, because it was a negative NAO, it pushed more storms toward land. And I've had arguments with people about this, but when you keep track of cities and islands that get impacted by named storms, and you do it that way versus just looking at tracks on a tracking map, you come up with a different conclusion. These are areas that have been impacted by 4 or more named storms since 1990. So when there's a negative NAO, these are the areas that tend to get hit more frequently. So what happened? Well, we had down here impacted. We had Jamaica impacted. We had Western Cuba impacted. We had the Yucatan impacted. We had the Morgan City impacted, and we had the Northwest Florida down to Tampa was all impacted. And of course, South Florida, I almost hate to include it because it was only like just barely 40 mile an hour, but near it was. And there's Grand Bahama impacted by Milton. And a few areas here on the east coast of Florida from Hurricane Milton and Helene as they passed through. So, I mean, that's quite a bit of areas that were impacted because we ended up having a negative NAO at the height of the hurricane season. It was minus 1.16 overall for August, September, and October. So there you go. It never was a neutral. It was a negative, and that resulted in more landfalls, and we saw that this year. 63% impacted. So that's what happens when you generally get a negative NAO. So I posted this graphic on social media. I said, if AI is wrong and the basin average leans negative, we could see more impacts to land, and that's exactly what happened. So you wonder what would happen at a positive NAO since 1990? Look at that, hardly any hits. A couple down in the central, the Windward Islands, the lower Florida Keys, Tampa and Spring Hill-ish area, maybe Wilmington, North Carolina, and the Outer Banks. That's it. That's the only areas that have been hit 4+ times since 1990 in a positive NAO. And we were the opposite this year, and that's why it was so busy. So overall, there was something else I wanted to mention about predictions. Let me see. Oh, by the way, I just wanted to quickly mention on the models, right? So if you take Beryl, Francine, Helene, and Milton, and Debbie, of course, Debbie was up there as a Category 1 in the Big Bend, Florida area. You take those 5 systems and you look at all the models. The model that performed the best overall this season was the HAFSA. It won 4 times in either track or intensity on those 5 systems. The second place was the HWRF, followed by the HAFSB, the Euro, and the Canadian. So those were the 5 best overall models this year. And I would have to give it to the HAFSA, which may be the replacement for the HWRF in the future. We're going to see how that all plays out. Okay, so let's get to our let's get to Beryl. And I have a folder set up for each one of these storms, so let's get that going. All right, so let's start with Beryl. Now, Beryl did end up impacting Grenada, Negril, Jamaica, Cozumel, Mexico, and Port O'Connor, Texas. Here's the wind swath from the HurTrack program, PC Weather Products. The link is on the front page of Hurricane City. But notice the red swath. That's where the real high winds of major hurricane force winds were. So naturally, it only impacted, it kind of split the uprights between Grenada, the mainland Grenada, and St. Vincent. So that the Grenadines, rather. The Grenadines were impacted directly by Beryl, the core of it. And then it went towards Jamaica, and we did some coverage on that as well. We covered it when it hit the Windward Islands. We covered it when it hit near Negril, Jamaica. and I did not cover it when it hit the Yucatan or Texas because it was down to Category 1, and I think my work schedule was conflicting with coverage on Beryl as it was moving closer to the United States. So here are the models from Hurricane City, and I'm always proud of these models when there's an active system developing in the Atlantic. Come to the front page of Hurricane City. I always encourage people to do this. The best performing models are automatically displayed on the map, and they're color coded, with red being the best and yellow being the worst out of the best 5 of all the models. And this calculates like 100 models. It takes almost every single model into consideration. The only thing about the best performing models is that they for the for example, the European model, it will not calculate that until it becomes a named storm. So for Invest, it'll use the other models like the GFS and the tropical models and the consensus models. But this was the red model was the HWRF, and I'm sorry, it was the HAFSA. That red model on the map down here was the HAFSA, and it nailed this track. And that's when it was way out in the Atlantic in the development stages, and it nailed the track through the Grenadines. So kudos to the best performing models at Hurricane City. That's all I can say. All right, so then it hit, and here's the HurTrack position. I do this for every landfalling hurricane and tropical system. Show when the moment of impact happened. The greatest moment of impact was right here on July 1st at 10 a.m. 140 mile an hour hurricane hit the island of Carico. And I believe I passed right over that island, as a matter of fact. And of course, that's when our coverage began. And that was our logo. The information, the coverage will begin shortly, July 1st. We started broadcasting, and I believe Bill was with me for that one as we covered this landfalling hurricane. And there's the graphic from our coverage. Look at the intense satellite image and the radar we had up. And we were monitoring all the data and the wind data from the islands down there as it was happening. And then, of course, here was the devastating results from Carico Island as many roofs were ripped off. It was completely devastating for the people of Carico. They're going to remember this hurricane will be retired, obviously. But Beryl did end up killing 73 people, and it was the earliest Category 5 on record. And it happened on July 2nd. Right after it passed the islands, it became a Category 5. So then it passed near Jamaica. So there was a hurricane warning up for the entire island, and we started our coverage when it was in this position, when it was closest to Negril, and the red skinny line represents the hurricane force winds, and of course the thick red donut are the intense hurricane winds right around the eye wall. So it will be considered as a hit for Negril, because the skinny red line did impact Negril, but they only had gusts to hurricane force. It wasn't like a devastating event for them. They dodged a huge bullet here as this hit. Again, we were covering that as it was happening. These are all on the archive page at Hurricane City. So then, yeah, there was our coverage graphic from when it was hitting near Jamaica. Notice the core of the hurricane force winds in the upper left-hand image there of yellow bands were right just south of the tip of Jamaica there. And I imagine they got raked pretty good by high winds, maybe 130 mile an hour winds down in the very southern portions of Jamaica. But it did not hit Kingston. They dodged the core of this hurricane. It was a brush for Kingston. And you notice the enhanced satellite there. You can see the brightest colors here around the eye wall were impacting the very southern tip of Jamaica, and we were covering that as it was happening. So there's where the worst conditions happened in Negril, Jamaica, past 28 miles to the south, and that was on July 3rd, and the winds were about 130 miles per hour, after it was earlier a Category 5 hurricane, by the way. It weakened down to Category 3, Category 4, as it was passing south of Jamaica. And then next stop was the Cayman Islands. We thought it was going to be a direct hit on the Cayman Islands, but there's the Caymans right there. And the core, of course, is down here. So it's considered a brush for the Cayman Islands, not a direct hit. They did get some gust up to hurricane force, but mainly tropical storm force winds in Grand Cayman as Beryl passed to the south. The next stop was Cozumel, Mexico. We did not cover this hurricane, but it was a 110 mile per hour Category 2 hurricane. Notice the small wind field. I mean, real tiny. It only impacted Cozumel, Mexico. It was a brush for Cancun, but definitely Cozumel got whacked directly by the northern eye wall as it moved in, and it was moving off to the west-northwest in the direction of Texas. And there was satellite as it was hitting Cozumel, Mexico, and you notice it was kind of coming apart a little bit. It was a little bit stretched out. It lost its eye characteristics there, and so it kind of really didn't come in there like as strong as it could have. So here's the TVCC. This is the best performing model, right, on the hurricane at that particular point when it was a Category 5. And look at the track that it predicted. It nailed it. Just south of Jamaica, just south of Cozumel, although it came a little closer to Cozumel than what that track indicated. And then it exited a little bit more north of Merida, Mexico. So overall, though, the consensus model did really well on Hurricane Beryl. And there was the radar from Belize as Hurricane Beryl was hitting Cozumel. And you notice the eye up in here, right up in here as it was hitting Cozumel. And the system was moving off to the west-northwest. A very good job of capturing that radar from the Belize Weather Service. So there was the official landfall of Hurricane Beryl. Again, was this? Yeah, this was the Yucatan Peninsula landfall. High gust of 81, and the winds were sustained around 60. 980 millibars. It made landfall 10 miles northeast of Tula, Mexico, with 110 mile per hour winds, pressure 975. So, I mean, it really wasn't that bad for them, considering the history of hurricanes that have hit the Yucatan Peninsula. Bill said 61% of the storms this year were hurricanes. That's crazy. And that's a really interesting stat. Yeah, 11 of them. I predicted 11 hurricanes, and we nailed that. So that was a really active hurricane. Only, I think, 5 or something were tropical storms. Usually it's like 50-50. So that was pretty amazing. By the way, if you want to comment, if you're listening tonight on social media, if you're on YouTube, Facebook, make a comment. I'll post it on air. So then it hit Texas. So this was a hurricane we did not cover this year that made landfall in the United States. And it was mainly due to my scheduling conflict. But I remember a lot of the chasers were there for this, and they were all saying, well, this was more than a Category 1. This had to be more than a Category 1. Two things come to mind. This is what Category 1 hurricanes do. Number 2, it's been a long time since you've been in a hurricane, right? I mean, this was your first hurricane since the 2003 season. So, in Texas, also, you don't have those big, tall condominiums run along the coast. Especially when you get further down the coast near Port O'Connor. So notice here, these were the actual measured buoy data out there. 87 mile an hour gust. That was at 2:12 a.m. as it was hitting Port O'Connor, Texas. So this was not a Category 2, even though people were trying to bump it up to a Category 2. And there's the recon data from our trusty software at Hurricane City that Chris Hollis puts together, and the best track data and the recon data shows the drop zone data, 979.4, highest winds 85 knots, the wind gust rather, and the peak FMR winds, which are at the surface, were 72 knots. That's 82.9 miles per hour. Folks, that was a Category 1 hurricane. It was not a Category 2 hurricane. More buoy data from offshore. Again, when it made landfall, 59 gusting to 75 knots. That's 85 miles per hour. That was the highest wind gust we could find on the buoys as it was making landfall. Here's another one, 59 gusting to 76, right off the coast of Port O'Connor as it was coming in. And finally, here's the final track of Beryl. And again, the red are the hurricane force winds, and barely scrapes Jamaica, hits Cozumel, and hits that small sliver between Galveston and Corpus Christi, Texas. That little area of Port O'Connor got the hurricane force winds as it came in. So that's a wrap from Beryl. And now let's go back to our next system, which was Hurricane Debbie. So Debbie was another one of these systems that I didn't go chase. I have a business to run in it. I had to do it, even though it was Florida. Usually when they hit the Florida Peninsula, I can get out there and cover it because my business, I get rained out, and it gives me a chance to go. But in this case, Debbie was kind of compact, and it was off into the Gulf, and it was hitting the northwest Florida Peninsula. So it was not really disrupting the weather down here, and I had to keep on going to work, so I could not get Hurricane Debbie. I'm not a big fan of chasing Category 1 hurricanes. I'm all about quality rather than quantity. And my thing is, I want to get in there when the pressure's like 960, minus 960 millibars, and you get the really high wind gusts that are violent winds. And Debbie just didn't look like that was going to be the case. But, again, it's a very small wind field of blue here that ended up here hitting near Perry, Florida, which I was up there last year for Hurricane Idalia. Bill and I were up there in Perry, Florida, and rode that hurricane out as a Category 3. We figured this was going to be much less than what that was, and it's a very tough chase environment in that area. So we did not cover that particular, or at least go there for that hurricane. This was the big story behind Debbie, though, is honestly the rainfall. So the Charleston, the South Carolina area really got hammered by heavy rains, and you can see based on the scale, there was upwards of almost 20 inches in some areas on the Carolina coastline. Debbie did kill 10 people, by the way, probably some from flooding, and there were some tornadoes. There was sporadic deaths, either during or after the hurricane, so it did take 10 lives. And the big story from this was again, the flooding up in South Carolina. So here's where it made landfall. And again, that's the Steinhatchee area. And I did not have my camera set up in any way, shape, or form to cover Hurricane Debbie, but it was the same exact areas that were impacted by Hurricane Idalia last year. And then there's Perry. Perry was hit directly. The eye passed right over Perry, population 6970. And this would also be hit later on by Hurricane Helene as well. So very active period for Northwest Florida. It seems to be the epicenter of all these hurricanes. They just want to be driven into the eastern Gulf of Mexico and be driven up into the Northwest Florida Big Bend area. It seems to be the hot spot. So look at Debbie last year and look at Idalia from last year and look at Debbie this year. Almost identical, except that Idalia was a Category 3 and Debbie was a Category 1. But I mean, look at that. Almost identical landfall position. Debbie may have been just a tad further south than Idalia was. But it's amazing how sometimes hurricanes can hit the same exact spot. I mean, the chances of anybody, if you stayed in one place, in one city, in the Atlantic Basin, your chances in your lifetime of seeing the eye pass over your house twice are pretty slim. You might get the core of a hurricane hit you, but getting the eye pass directly over is amazing. And then it happened later on with Helene as well. So, I mean, it's truly amazing that the eye passed over this same exact area 3 times in the past 2 years. It's incredible. And that was our coverage. Of course, I was in my work shirt there and scrambled in to cover this. It was hitting, I think, very early in the morning. And there was some cameras south of there that I was monitoring. But overall, there wasn't a whole lot to cover on Hurricane Debbie. It was a tough hurricane to cover. It was a short file that's up at the archive page, but there was the landfall of Hurricane Debbie, and it hit at 7 a.m. The eye made landfall near Steinhatchee, and it came ashore with 979 millibars, winds 80 miles per hour, and it was 10 miles west of Steinhatchee, Florida, and 70 miles southeast of Tallahassee, made landfall, 80 mile per hour winds. And I remember some of the storm chasers that were like, oh my God, they were there and they were like, where's the wind? I'm glad I didn't go cover Hurricane Debbie because it was just been a money suck, which money's tight for running this website as it is. And I'm glad I just made the call not to go get Hurricane Debbie. But the rainfall was the big steal again, 10 to 15 inches estimated rainfall in South Carolina, and they had a lot of flooding, and that was probably partial of the cause of the deaths from Hurricane Debbie. And there's the rainfall swaths from Hurricane Debbie in the Charleston area. We're talking, 6 to 8 inches as the hurricane was making landfall, but they had upwards of 15 to 20 inches in some areas. And there's the final impacts of Debbie using my impact maps. And so it came down to the red areas where that does not mean they were hit by a hurricane if there's a red dot. It just means that it was a hurricane at the closest point of approach when they got the winds over 40 miles per hour. So it was considered a hurricane impact for the Steinhatchee area, obviously, for Panacea, Florida, for Cedar Key, and for Tampa. It was considered a brush, of course, but it was a hurricane when it impacted them, and for Tarpon Springs. And of course, all the blue dots were tropical storm force winds caused by Hurricane Debbie as it passed its closest point of approach. And that's it for Debbie. So, again, I'm glad I didn't go get Debbie. It was just one of those hurricanes that, it would have cost a lot of money and it wouldn't have really been worth it. And there wasn't a whole lot to report from the impacted areas as it was hitting. Compared to what Idalia did last year, it was like nothing for them up there, even though they did get impacted. And it was bad. I mean, I'm not saying a Category 1 is not bad, but it wasn't the Idalia impacts that they had the previous year. So next on the docket was Hurricane Francine, and we covered that hurricane. And here is the wind swath from the HurTrack program. And you can see that Francine was, it developed in the southwestern Gulf of Mexico and then moved off to the northeast. It got caught up in a front. And the wind band wind field would indicate that these were where the hurricane force winds impacted a very small area between Intercoastal City and Grand Isle, but the bulk of it was in the Morgan City area and Abbeville and areas like that. And again, a lot of these areas did not get those 103 mile per hour winds, but they did get the hurricane force wind field from Hurricane Francine. But the wind shear was a big deal with Francine. And the reason Francine didn't become a major hurricane, as you can see, the wind shear, the red barbs here in the northern Gulf of Mexico were just screaming over the top of it. 30, 40, 50, 60 knots of wind shear from the west did not allow that to really get its act together as it headed towards Louisiana. So that was another decision I made not to go get Hurricane Francine. It did not, even though it hit as a Category 2, it did not look like it was going to be the major hurricane for me to travel 1,000 miles and cover. And again, generally, it's a hard area to chase. I've been there for Hurricane Delta, and I believe there was one other hurricane. I'm not sure. Oh, Ida and Delta. And I was around that area for both of those hurricanes. And for Delta, it was treacherous, especially down in Intercoastal City, Louisiana. It goes underwater very easily. And I was trapped from getting my instruments and my cameras back. And I drove through some really deep floodwaters. It was a really treacherous chase, very hard area to chase in central Louisiana there. So I decided to skip that one. So there was the landfall from the HER track program. The donut would indicate the winds of 100 miles per hour as it made landfall, and the skinny red line would indicate gusts up to hurricane force or hurricane force winds generally, but the donut is where those winds of 100 miles per hour were, and they really never really made it much on shore. By the time it got into Morgan City, it was probably in the Category 1 range. And again, I've been to Morgan City, and they really don't seem to take the hurricanes too seriously, at least from the people I've talked to in the hotels and the local, people that live there year round. Didn't seem to be too overly concerned when Ida was hitting there back in 21. So I'm sure they didn't take this that seriously up there, but nevertheless, it did hit there as a Category 2 hurricane. And the big deal in this area is always the storm surge flooding. So here were the projections from the National Hurricane Center of 5 to 10 feet for Hurricane Francine. And then it ended up doing this. So that looked like more like 4 feet of surge that rolled in. This was a live cam from the Lumcon University cameras on the Gulf of Mexico. They did a great job keeping these cams up during the hurricane. That video, again, is on our archive page, and this video streams live for like an hour, and you can see the surge rolling in, and you can see the winds blowing the water around. But, I mean, the Gulf of Mexico was right here, and the winds and the water was rushing in from the Gulf of Mexico, and it was filling in, but it never got to where, see how all these houses are elevated out here? And the water was down in here. So that's why they put them on stilts. So that way the houses were built served their purpose for a storm like Hurricane Francine. So there was the final wind swath on Francine from the National Hurricane Center. And again, a little tiny sliver of hurricane force winds made it on shore in the Morgan City area up towards Lake Pontchartrain, but New Orleans and all those areas, it's considered a brush. Only these areas around Morgan City got the direct impacts from Hurricane Francine as it made its way into Louisiana. So then we head to our next storm, which was Helene. And Helene was the beast. Helene was the big storm of the year, the one that is going to be retired and we're going to be talking about for years. Here is the wind swath from the HER track program. And again, you can see the core winds impacted a very tiny area. And that was between Tallahassee and Perry, Florida, where Perry, Florida got the worst of it. The right front quadrant passed right over there. In fact, they got the eye over Perry, and areas like Tallahassee completely dodged the bullet. And this was an extremely frustrating hurricane for me to cover on a personal level. Bill and I were on the phone, and we were like, do we go get this? Do we not go get it? And it was that hard area, again, that Perry, Florida, Northwest Florida area that's really hard to chase hurricanes. And I was struggling with it. Bill was hemming and hawing about whether he wanted to go. And then he decided not to come because there's just the flight were not working out, whatnot. By the way, here's another comment that's popped up here. Icon run from 7.3 nailed barrels track pretty much on, spot on. Don't know how to send the file. Well, look, let me look back at that. So you said on barrels. So let me look back at that. On barrel, this is based on the 5-day model of all the runs combined over a 5-day period. So barrel, the HMON was, so the HAFSA did the best on track, off by 226 on barrel, right? The HMON was off by 233. So the HMON did do well. It was just right behind the HAFSA. The HAFSA slightly outperformed. I'm sorry, you're talking about the Icon model. So here's the thing about the Icon. I misunderstood your question. Sorry. The Icon model probably did do good on that, but the best track data doesn't track the Icon model. Chris and I have talked about this for years. It'll track the Icon for intensity, but not on track. For whatever reason, it's not in the best performing models. That's the only model that's missing. And I guess it's because of the way they disseminate the data that we're unable to incorporate it into our best performing models. So, yeah, that may very well be that the icon did well on that. So I appreciate you, Hurricane FF, commenting on that. Appreciate that. Yeah, that icon did do. The icon had a good year actually. The icon, there was a few storms that it kind of nailed the track early on. So the icon had a good year, but I don't have that in on the best performing models, unfortunately. So I do appreciate those comments. Anyway, back to Helene. So here was Helene when it was in the development stages, down splitting the Yucatan and western Cuba. And this was from the Cuban Weather Service office as it was getting its act together. And at that time, the track map at Hurricane City, I love to pull up the map at Hurricane City that has all the ships and the buoy data because you can find out what the pressures are out in front of a hurricane. And a little secret inside baseball, you generally, when a hurricane is heading in a straight line, and they usually never do, but when they're heading in a direct path, what you do is you look for pressure readings out in front of where the hurricane is headed, right? So if you look at the Northwest Florida area, all that data buoy around up in this area here, up in these areas, you use all these buoy datas up in here, and wherever the pressures are the lowest is generally where the hurricane is going to head. It's not always accurate, but it's a pretty good indicator of where a hurricane's going to head. So I like to look at the buoy maps at Hurricane City and run the pressures and see, if an area is going to be more drawn to one area versus another. And I trying to be funny here, I put the megaphone on there and said, move your asses, because there were some boats out there that were moving rather slowly out in front of Hurricane Helene, and they have to get all that cargo from Texas or wherever they're from, Louisiana, and get it over to Florida, and they were all heading in that general direction. So I thought that graphic was kind of funny. So here is an animation of Hurricane Helene that Bill sent me right before I was hitting the road. In fact, yeah, he sent this after I hit the road. I got this when I was at the, I believe, my location where I was going to intercept Hurricane Helene. And he sent me this animated satellite image. And, it was pretty intense, but it was maintaining itself. And it was a really intense hurricane, 140-mile-per-hour winds, beautiful satellite image. And here were the storm surge projections from the National Hurricane Center. Again, 10 to 15 feet in the Big Bend area. And water, I don't like to get near water. That's why I set the cameras up on the coast. And for those of you that have followed me for years, I don't put myself in danger when I chase these hurricanes. I put my cameras in danger. And then I retreat to where the edge of the storm surge zone is going to be. So I'm never caught off guard in storm surge and never will be. I always stay outside the surge zone and then let the cameras take the beating. But this was a difficult hurricane because here's what happens. So I deploy and I get up into the impact area, and I was on the phone with Bill, and we were hemming and hawing over where to go for Hurricane Helene, because some of the models, the NHC forecast track was showing it going right over Tallahassee, right? And going over Panacea and kind of hitting that no man's land area between Tallahassee and Perry. So I decided, well, maybe I'll stay in Tallahassee. Then the models were kind of shifting a little to the right. And I'm like, well, maybe I should go to Perry. So I drove all the way. I checked out of the hotel in Tallahassee. And by the way, getting a hotel in Tallahassee was like, forget it. You're never going to get a hotel. They had every single hotel booked in Tallahassee. I was literally getting paranoid trying to find lodging in that area. But anyway, I checked out, right? Big mistake. Well, it wasn't a big mistake. Actually, I should have stayed checked out of Tallahassee. I went to Perry. Couldn't find a hotel. Then I got to the Holiday Inn in Perry, and they did have one vacancy. So I said, okay, let's book it. So I'm there in Perry, where I should have been for the hurricane, and then the models started to shift a little to the left. And the Hurricane Center was insisting that this was going to come closer to Tallahassee than Perry, and I figured the bigger story was going to be in Tallahassee. So I canceled the reservations at the Holiday Inn and I go back to Tallahassee. Huge mistake. I get to Tallahassee. I can't find a hotel. Well, actually, I was able to get back in the same hotel that I checked out of. They saved the room for me. I told them, please save the room just in case I change my mind and I have to get back to Tallahassee. A nice Indian couple that ran the hotel. They allowed me to get back into the hotel. It was a different room, but nevertheless, I was able to get back there. And that's where I ended up riding out Hurricane Helene. But it was a huge mistake. I should have been over in Perry. However, the stories that I heard coming out of Perry, first of all, you're 20 miles inland when you're covering the hurricane. It was in the middle of the night, and the cops were everywhere. They were swarming, and they weren't letting the storm chasers cover this. They weren't letting them out there with their cameras. They were trying to chase everybody out of the area. It seemed like it was a nightmare. I'll show you that graphic in just a minute. But it turned out that I was in the wrong place in Tallahassee. I got missed, but I didn't have to deal with the aggravation they had to deal with in Perry as a result of the law enforcement there. So again, that surge was the big deal, and it turned out really not to be the big story of Hurricane Helene. So there was the projected landfall from the National Hurricane Center, 120 miles an hour. Look at that track, right over Tallahassee. I mean, Tallahassee is right, in this general area, right up in here, right? And it was projecting that the hurricane was going to hit Tallahassee. And that's why I stayed in Tallahassee as opposed to going over to Perry. Well, this track did not pan out. That was the one beef I had with the National Hurricane Center this year, was that insisting track of having it near Panacea, Tallahassee. And that never ended up happening. So here it was offshore. This is when I was making all my decisions. And notice the size of the wind field. It's pretty expansive. It grew. I mean, look at the size of the wind, the hurricane force wind field. That's pretty massive. And then, of course, the 140 mile an hour core was right there. And so I figured, even if I'm here, I'm going to get hurricane force winds, right? But that turned out not to be the case. So there was when it was right offshore, but that image was a little bit deceiving because it made it look like the hurricane force wind field was gigantic. Even though it was a large wind field, look at the tropical storm force winds all the way down to South Florida. But the sustained tropical storm force winds was just north of Tampa, and the hurricane force core was this small area right up in here in the Big Bend, Florida area. And so based on that data, I was figuring, okay, Tallahassee will get those hurricane force winds. So there's the actual landfall as it was coming in. And I'm up in here, sitting over here, like that. And that didn't end up happening. And there was the official landfall from the National Hurricane Center on Hurricane Helene. It made landfall with 938 millibars, 70 miles northwest of Cedar Key, and the maximum sustained winds were 140 miles per hour, and it was moving northeast at 24 miles an hour. It was hauling ass when it got up in that area. And there's where it was when it was at the closest point of approach to me. And there was my pressure in Tallahassee. Again, see down here, 970 millibars. That's what I measured, even though I was not in the core of the hurricane. I was off to the left. So here was Jordan Hall talking about the police and law enforcement up there. Over 20 Sheriff and Florida Highway Patrol vehicles stationed at the bank in Perry were chasing down everyone who even drives on the road. This is madness. Care more about the storm chasers than they do the storm. This is wild. And he was frustrated. And it's one of the reasons I'm glad I wasn't up there in Perry for Hurricane Helene, because it would have just been dealing with a lot of being hassled by law enforcement, which I can't stand. I really wish they would leave the chasers alone. The chasers, there's never been a chaser killed in a hurricane. If they've been killed, it was maybe reckless driving in the aftermath or something, but I've never heard of a hurricane hunter being killed in a hurricane, and I think they need to leave these guys alone and let them cover the cover the hurricane. That's what they're there for. The storm chasers are safe. There's a few that are reckless, but the majority of them, they don't move around too much in the hurricane. They stay in one place. You know, they try to get the good shots, but they're aware of where the roofs are going to come off and where the flooding is and that sort of thing. So I think they need to just lay off a little bit. Anyway, this was the position of Hurricane Helene when I was getting my worst conditions in Tallahassee. And again, I'm right off to the left over here, sitting right in this position right here, just right outside the hurricane force wind field, which was extremely frustrating. And, you know, it was very frustrating. So here's what ended up happening in, this was in Steinhatchee and down in the little area that I had my camera up last year for Idalia, which was, what's the name of that? Anyway, it's Keaton Beach. So we were going to put the cameras, when I say we, I was going to put the cameras up here. This was my place to put the cameras up. I put the cameras up there last year, but I got there and there was no connectivity. I couldn't get a cell connection if my life depended on my remote cameras. Normally they get good connectivity. For some reason after Idalia, they were never able to recover the infrastructure correctly, so I could not get the camera to connect there or the one in Steinhatchee. That's what I would have caught. Now, when I hooked the camera up there for Idalia last year, a few of the structures got knocked down, but nothing like this. This would have been absolutely epic footage that just got missed. I just missed the footage because I could not get the cameras to connect. So it was a bust all the way around on Hurricane Helene. So I went into Perry afterwards to get some aftermath footage, and there was a grocery store that had the fascia ripped off, but the windows were still kind of intact. I think there was one window busted. This hotel here, these poor people, see that green roof? That was all replaced after Idalia, but the canopy blew off. Like, look at the whole canopy of the roof, just completely blew off, and there was some news media there covering it as I was filming, and, you know. But the big story with Helene was North Carolina. I know even though I missed it in where it came ashore, the big story with Hurricane Helene was all the deaths and destruction up there in western North Carolina. And as you can see here from the National Weather Service in the Charleston area, I mean, just absolutely devastating. 243 dead. There's 26 still missing. Look at the rainfall. You know, this was after the core of the rainfall had already fallen. But look at North Carolina. 30.78 inches of rain. That's a lot of rain. And at the time that it hit North Carolina, when it got its closest point of approach, it was a post-tropical system. It wasn't even a named storm anymore at that point. So it just goes to show you, even when they become post-tropical, they can be deadly. And I always like to equate it to a large sponge that you completely get soaked in water and then you put it over land and you rinse it. And that's what happened here in the case of Helene. It just rinsed the sponge out over the Carolinas and in Tennessee and Kentucky. The flooding was horrendous. And again, 243 dead, 26 missing. And by the way, this thing had a pressure of 987 millibars up in Kentucky. That's Category 1 pressure up in Kentucky. That's amazing. It had a lot of energy to dispense up in the Carolinas, and they paid the price. So here was the final wind swath on Hurricane Helene. Again, no hit down in the Caribbean as a hurricane, but it did hit this area. And again, east of Tallahassee, they narrowly dodged a bullet. But here's what the video looked like. Now, I did have a camera set up in Monticello, Florida, because I tried to go down. There was just no mounting possibilities, and the connectivity was terrible. So I decided to just make something out of the cameras. I took one of them. It was Bill's magnetic camera, and I mounted it on at a gas station where a lot of trucks come in and fuel up, and there were a lot of first responders that were there waiting out the hurricane, and there was some pretty ferocious winds. So here's the video from Hurricane Helene when it was in Monticello and our overall coverage of it. And again, this is south of I-10. This is closer to the Gulf than north of I-10. And these were northerly northwest winds coming into the Monticello area. Pretty amazing winds for that far inland, and this was on the backside of Hurricane Helene when it was hitting. Yeah, they're right. See Monticello, but they're south of I-10, that camera. See, here they are. Look at all these trees down. And the tree damage was much worse than Idalia. This is in Steinhatchee. The police would not let me into the impacted area, so I turned around and left. This is worse than Idalia with tree damage here in Steinhatchee. Look at all these. Snap, snap, snap all the way along the road there. It's only going to be one-way traffic here for a little while until the crews get in here and clear all these trees. Wow, look at all the snappage out here. Very strong southwest winds coming into Steinhatchee. Let me get out of here. All right. And again, there's reiterating that my camera could not connect, so I didn't set it up there, even though that's kind of the footage that I would have caught was all those buildings coming down. It was just really unfortunate. All right, so now we get to Milton, and from a personal level on Milton, this was the storm that I got the most excitement out of, and it was my best intercept of the year. And it was probably one of my best intercepts. But quickly back to, I just want to get say one more thing about Helene. So the National Hurricane Center did the best on Hurricane Helene on the track. They were off by 74 miles overall, and the best model beyond NHC was the H-Wharf at 82 miles. So the National Hurricane Center outperformed the main models on Hurricane Helene. I'm sorry, on 105 miles off on Helene. The UK Met was 117 miles off. So on Hurricane Helene, the National Hurricane Center won the track on Helene. So they did really well on the track on Helene, and on the intensity, it was the HAFSA that did the best on Hurricane Helene. So just wanted to let you know that. All right, so back to Milton. So here we go on Milton. Again, Milton's hits were for Tampa, not major. Sarasota, 35 people died. 180 mile an hour, strongest hurricane of the season. And it got down to 897 millibars, and it kicked off 46 tornadoes, which is the fifth most tornadoes of any hurricane in history. So it was quite a prolific hurricane. But here's the HUR track showing what happened. It became a Cat 5 down in this area, and it just rapidly exploded down in here. And notice the size of the wind field. It escaped the Yucatan. I don't even think it was a brush for Merida, Mexico, which is down in here somewhere. And of course, the Yucatan, Cancun, Cozumel got missed altogether. So it was a small, compact storm that behaved itself, but everybody knew it was coming to Florida, and it was probably the biggest hype job of the entire season as far as media attention. So here was the front page, the map on the front page of Hurricane Center. This was the National Hurricane Center forecast track. They pretty much nailed this track. That's a really, really good track, right? On Hurricane Milton, you know, they were a little off on the intensity, saying 100 miles an hour, but it got up to Cat 5. They were way off on the intensity, no doubt about it. But the track, as usual, was spot on. They did a really good job on the track. So here's where Milton ranks amongst all the major hurricanes in history. And it's in the top five, 897 millibars. And only Rita, the Labor Day hurricane of 1935, Hurricane Gilbert, and Hurricane Wilma, when it was down in the Caribbean, had a lower pressure. And that was when it was 650 miles southwest of Tampa. It had 180 mile per hour winds. So here were all the models at Hurricane City. And if you ever want to play with models, Hurricane City is a great place to do it. So what you do is you click on the best track data right below the tracking map, and it takes you to the best to the model page. You do is choose models on a Google map. It's right there at the top. You click it, and then you can toggle or untoggle whatever models you want to see and what they're showing the projection. This only shows you the center line of the model. It does not show you the wind field. So it's just a general something to play with. But this is all the models, right, on one map. And you can see them coagulating between Sarasota and Tarpon Springs for the most part. That was the landfall projections for most of the models, and they were pretty much spot on with it. So here was the eye of Hurricane Milton when it was a Category 5 hurricane. Of course, it was out of radar range. This is from Cancun's radar. And you could still see the eye, even the backside eye, but was much more intense than this. But it just shows you how small that wind field really is. I mean, look at that. It's like, that's it. And all these are tropical storm force winds. So, I mean, it was a tiny core, but those are the kind of hurricanes that can rapidly intensify, and that's exactly what happened. And this is what the projection was from the National Hurricane Center. It wasn't perfect. It was predicting it to come in just south of Tampa, the city, and north of Sarasota. So here's where my dilemma came in on Milton. Neither one of the storms that I intercepted this year were easy, and it's because I made it hard on myself. Of course, Hurricane Helene, I already told you. Helene was because I hem and hawed between Tallahassee and Perry and made the wrong choice. And in the case of Milton, it was because I was staying at my father's up in the Villages, up in North Florida, which is it's just south of Gainesville, right in the Gainesville area. And I decided, you know what? I'll help him get his generator set up, and because they're going to get tropical storm force winds out of this, they might lose their power. So we had all kinds of problems with the generator, and it was, constantly working on the generator. And then they wanted me to stay for dinner, and I'm like, I gotta go. I can't, I have to leave, and I left a little too late, and I should have been paying a little bit closer attention to how quickly this was approaching the coastline. Because again, the National Hurricane Center was projecting 2 o'clock in the morning. The eye would be over Sarasota, and it started making landfall at 8 o'clock at night. So I was hauling ass to get down from North Florida down to the Tampa area. And it was tough. It was a real tough chase. And I made it hard on myself because I waited a little too long to make the move. And here's what the projection was, 2 a.m. So I felt I had time if I left at 8 o'clock. But I had to really quickly leave at like 5 o'clock, and I barely made it there in time. And this is what happened when the hurricane hunters flew out there. Look at this. Ragged eye wall, severe turbulence, and hail entering the northwest eye wall. You very rarely will see a hurricane hunter report hail in an eye wall. And it happened with Hurricane Milton. Amazing. So here's where it actually made landfall. right in Sarasota at 9 p.m. There's the landfall, and it's directly over Sarasota. So again, Bill hem and hawed over whether he wanted to come for this intercept and decided not to. I think he had a medical appointment or something, and he couldn't make that one, so he decided not to come. So I went up to my dad's, flew, traveled real fast south, and I was caught on I-75 trying to get down into position to get to where the hurricane was hitting, and it was treacherous. So as the hurricane was moving in, all hell was breaking loose. Bill was covering the remote cameras on the shoreline, and I was, naturally using my dash cam heading down towards the impacted areas. And you'll hear a lot of this, during the video. Something blew up. That's Bill. That's the most animated I've ever heard Bill when a hurricane is approaching the coast. One more time. That is so funny. That is like the most animated. At the beginning of the video, it's like, something is on fire. And then he said, something blew up. And this is when I was on I-75 heading south. And naturally, I can't look at the cameras. I can't. So I was relying on him to give me guidance as to what was happening on the coast as I was heading down there. But anyway, here's a brief recap video of what happened as this was hitting. And it's truly incredible video between the two cameras. We had one in Venice and one in Sarasota. One in the beach right on Sarasota on for God's sakes, his name is slipping my mind at the moment. But here's the video anyway from the coastline as this was coming in. Truly incredible.
Geomagnetic storm activity. Oh, something just blew up.
That whole building caught on fire. We didn't realize the extent of it.
Something's on fire.
It was like the 4th of July. I see it. Very top of the radar. You see my position north of the eye. And here's me on the inside of the truck, absolutely terrified as I'm driving.
The landfall was called at Siesta Key at 8:30.
Okay, 0 miles an hour right now. No wind.
You're right in the eye.
And the power was still on. That's what I found amazing. It's dead calm up there. It's just foggy. Look, it's just kind of foggy.
Got a view. Something blew up.
It was so calm. I've never been in such a calm eye. Sally is the only thing that was similar to that. Is there a fire there or something? What's going on?
I don't know.
This went on for a long time. Now that
I think the building's caught fire. We could lose this camera. This is why they tell you to evacuate in hurricanes, folks. Normally, they wouldn't let a fire like this burn.
Very good point by Bill there. By the way, that anemometer measured 117. To the pole. The building behind it did not get burned. We were capturing on that camera embers and debris flying that was on fire. And I want to pause the video here for a second. So you see me in the screen there. This is a camera I have mounted on top of the truck. And there I am out in front of the truck filming. this was I'm fascinated by video when I see a two perspective film. In other words, you have one camera in the person's hand and then another one from a distant area. And I pieced this together with both the camera that I was holding in my hand and the camera from the truck. It's truly a masterpiece. I mean, some people don't probably notice stuff like this, but I like to do stuff like this, and I'm going to try to do more of this kind of thing. But it's really hard to piece this together, and I'm just proud of myself for this segment of the video. Anyway, here it is. You notice me, you'll see me from time to time from the truck's perspective, and then me up close. And look at this. So it's pretty bad here. I mean, this whole thing was burning for hours and hours throughout the night. And the camera was picking all this, the embers blowing toward these buildings over here, but nothing caught fire on this side. But the surge was all in here, and that fire went on for a really long time. It's a real shame what happened here. Luckily, nobody was here at the time. And there we go through this door. It leads out to the beach. I mean, look at the whole thing is gutted in here. All this was on fire. The whole thing burned down in here. All right, so that was the video we shot. I mean, the whole archive is about 35, 40 minutes long. It can be found on the archive page and the drop-down menus. But that hurricane, you know, Bill and I talked about it, and we're like, this may have been one of the most interesting intercepts I've ever had. And I've been in some really doozies, like Hurricane Michael up in small town that's just slipping my mind, where I was in the eye of Hurricane Michael. And Hurricane Delta was very interesting. Hurricane Sally was very interesting. This one was very interesting. And it made it more interesting because I put myself in kind of more difficult situation in this time around than I did in those past storms. But because those storms I was all set up and ready to go. This time I was frantically trying to get in position, which it'll never happen again. But as far as thrill of being in it, you know, even though I was inland on I-75, that wind was kicking that truck. I mean, it was blowing really hard. Sarasota got hammered pretty hard by this hurricane. They did a good job restoring the power and getting the infrastructure back, but they did take a hard hit in this area. So here was the landfall from the National Hurricane Center as it made landfall. Winds of 120 miles per hour, and it was about 5 miles west of Sarasota as it made landfall. That was right where the cameras were set up, so the eye passed right over them. Of course, it was dark and you couldn't really see anything, but nevertheless. And again, the wind gusts 97 miles an hour, 77, 78, gust to 100 at a weather flow. And I had gusts around 100 at my location as well in the truck. And I showed you that on the live stream. If you watch the entire video, you'll see those digital readouts on that anemometer. We just question the integrity of the anemometer because there's so many different brands and makes of anemometers out there. And it's hard to say whether it's accurate or not. You can put a leaf blower on an anemometer. If it says 73 miles per hour coming out of the package and it's blowing 73 on your instrument, you can pretty much say it's accurate. And so, on the other hand, I'm thinking, wait a minute, in Idalia we measured 163 gust. So it seemed like it was a little far-fetched to me. It could have been a tornado, spin up right over the top of the truck. Anything could have been possible. Could have been a mesovortice of some sort, but this time I measured 100. I was feeling confident about that, but not 100%. So, but looking at the readings from the Hurricane Center when it made landfall, it seems like it lines up, even though I was a few miles inland. So it might have been a little lower where I was sitting, but it was still pretty ferocious. And again, there was my lowest pressure, 959 millibars. So even when I got home, Milton did damage in my neighborhood. Now I measured 46. And this is a house that's right around the corner from my house. I can see it from the tower. And that tree crushed that house. Like, So there was some good gusts coming in here, and those are called Norfolk pines. And Norfolk pines usually don't fall unless the winds get up to 100 miles an hour. So I'm wondering if they weren't higher here in Delray Beach than the 46 that I measured. But look at the damage to the roof there. I mean, that's tremendous damage. I mean, somebody told me that there was somebody in one of those rooms and they survived. Nobody was injured, but that was right around the corner from my house. So back to my questions and comments. Tom, he's a big hurricane fan. Thomas Magula. He's in Punta Gorda. Our wind gusts were in the mid 80s range. Had I been 25 miles away in Venice, I would have had near Cat 2 sustained winds. Yeah, I agree with that. I mean, that's what we were kind of measuring when I was there. Bill, the other was in Venice. Yeah, I mentioned that. Carlos Espinola, what was the lowest pressure you measured in the eye? 959. Yep, yeah, you just saw 959. Okay. Anyway, anybody else want to comment before the show's over? Here's the final wind swath on Hurricane Milton. And again, just north of the Yucatan, and the core impacts were between Tampa and Port Charlotte, with Sarasota getting the brunt of it, and Tampa. By the way, Tampa, it was not a major hurricane. When you run the HurTrack program, it shows as a major hurricane making landfall, and the skinny red line reaches up into Tampa, but they did not get major hurricane force winds in Tampa, so it's not considered a major hit for Tampa. Even though it hit land as a major hurricane, it was not a major hurricane for Tampa. So their streak continues since 1950 of not having a major hurricane hit Tampa, but they were impacted heavily. You saw the damage pictures from the wind and all Tampa took a really hard hit from Hurricane Milton. No doubt about it. All right, so with that said, that's pretty much it for the show tonight. Again, to wrap things up, the National Hurricane Center outperformed the models on Debbie on track, right? The NHC outperformed the models on the track for Debbie, and the track on Helene, and the track on Milton. The NHC won the intensity battle on Hurricane Beryl and on Hurricane Milton. Believe it or not, even though they didn't predict it was going to become a Category 5, they still were off by 5 knots on a total package of model runs that came out during the course of Milton. They were off by 5. The next best model was the HAFSA at 7 knots off. So the Hurricane Center had a very good year. They won five wins on the storms that mattered, and that's it. Oh, and by the way, on Milton, the best performing model was the HWRF, off by 82 miles, and on intensity, it was the HAFSA on Milton, were the best performing models on Hurricane Milton. So to wrap things up tonight, rough season for Florida, especially if you go north of the lake all the way up to Tallahassee. It was kind of a rough year. The other hits, Francine, yeah, nothing Louisiana can't handle. And as far as Texas, the same thing with Beryl, nothing they can't handle. The Grenada area got absolutely annihilated. The North Carolina area from Hurricane Helene was devastating. So the hardest hit areas were North Carolina, outside of the hurricane zone. It wasn't even a tropical storm when it did the worst damage up there. Grenada, hardest hit, and the Tampa area and the Perry area were hard hit this year. What holds next year? What are we going to see next year? Are we going to see El Nino? I know we're supposed to be heading into La Nina, but they say the La Nina was only going to last through the spring. So what falls after that? Are we back to neutral again? Are we going to head back into back into El Nino? Maybe later in the next hurricane season. I don't know, but all I know is we're seeing more and more named storms, and we're seeing more and more intense hurricanes um, that are rapidly intensifying in very short periods of time, and this is due to climate change. So that's a definite. I'm willing to say that I was a little hesitant a few years back to admit that, but I think now that the facts are coming out that it's definitely having an impact with the warm sea surface temperatures are rapidly causing rapid intensification. I mean, look at last year, and what was it? Mexico went from nothing to a Cat 5 in like 36 hours. I mean, it's crazy. But one thing this year, we didn't get any landfall in Category 5s in the Atlantic Basin. I have a map up here in the office that shows only Cat 5 landfalling hurricanes. And that is, I didn't have to take it down and adjust it this year. We had no Cat 5 landfalling hurricanes, but we did have a Category 5, two Category 5s in the Atlantic. So that's pretty incredible. So again, donations are heavily needed. A lot of things I got to get straightened out for next hurricane season. I still have my health. I know I did a lot of videos on my health from 22 through 2023. I'm feeling really good right now on a personal level. I hope to continue running Hurricane City. I'm going to do the redesign in the off season, and I appreciate you all for the support. Bill Phillips just mentioned that one storm they did screw up on was Oscar. Yeah, well that was that was the Pacific storm. Yeah, I mean that's, and of course the models really didn't handle Raphael very well because they were all for a while there saying Florida, 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 and the media was running crazy with that. But the National Hurricane Center, I got to give them credit, and the local news, a lot of the local news stations down here were tampering that down. They were like, let's see if it gets within 5 days. We'll talk about it more, but we don't think that this is going to be a threat to Florida at this time. And they ended up being right about that. That was, something that really the national media ran with. And I think the local media was responsible. The National Hurricane Center was responsible on their outlooks on that. And it turned out that it went the other way. It went, and the same thing with Sarah. There was talk of Sarah coming up as well. And that ended up dipping down into Central America, dumping a whole bunch of rain down there in Honduras and Belize. But overall, it was a very active season. A lot of people got impacted. So let's hope next year we don't have as many impacts. I mean, if you get 50%, that's an average year. We were 63%. We could end up like 2020 and get 80% impacts. It could happen. But anyway, that's it. Again, thank you, Bill, for helping me out this year. Thank you for Chris in Tampa for everything he did this year with Hurricane City. And thank you all. We'll see you next year for the kickoff show. I'm Jim Wlliams.